Hi, you're listening to Defend Your Time, brought to you by Ontinue. I'm your host, Chris Taylor. This is the podcast where we help you get stronger security, more value, and fewer headaches out of your Microsoft security investments. And today I promise to do it in under 15 minutes. Last week, Ontinue's Advanced Threat Operations team published their H1 2024 threat report, and I'm now joined by Zach Garcia and Dom DeVito to get into this report's findings and what they mean for security leaders. In this conversation, we'll cover several topics, including how and why security leaders should leverage Defender for Endpoint's vulnerability scanning capabilities to ensure strong patch adoption. We'll also talk about LOL sites, which exploit Microsoft-owned domains to bypass security controls. Today's podcast episode isn't a deep dive into the report. Instead, we're trying to use this time to highlight how security teams might use this intelligence to get stronger security. Now, a little context. Ontinue offers a managed XDR service that protects millions of endpoints across a variety of sectors. And thanks to this advanced threat operations team, we're able to take that massive data set and extrapolate the key trends that we hope will help your security team. So, Zach, Dom, thank you for joining me today. Let's dive into this report. So, Zach, my first question to you. As a security leader, how do you read a report like this?
Just off the top of my head, first comes to mind, I'm sitting here. I'm in charge of security for somewhere, and I'm reading this report. I'm going to use this to help gain better context about the broader trends. Here's someone who has access to a larger sample size than what I have, which is just my environment. First thing I'm thinking is, are there trends that are specific to my industry? Am I covered? What am I doing about this already? Where are my gaps? I mean, that's just my first immediate thought. How are things changed from last year? Where are things going? How do I get ahead?
Dom, similar question. Thinking from the lens of a CISO, how do you look at a threat intelligence report like this?
I've dealt with a lot in the past. They're always concerned about the thing that might get them, the gotchas. There's gaps in your environment that you know about, but the threat actors are opening new gaps. If there's a new vulnerability in this, there's a new situation, new attack vector that are coming out. Those are, should we say, new gaps that you're not necessarily be aware of. So I think that for me is the thing that a CISO will be interested in. What do I need to get budget for next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what a CISO does, right? Is they figure out what they don't know, because you don't know what you don't know, and you can't, it's hard to protect against that. So part of being a CISO is trying to look ahead.
Okay, so one of the key findings we wrote about is the ongoing lag in vendor patch adoption. Half of the top vulnerabilities targeted by threat actors were CVEs that were discovered last year. So is our message really just get better at patching?
Yeah, I mean, patching is an important one, but it also is kind of like an old song and dance that everyone knows you should be patching. But maybe what people don't know is that there were so many high-scoring CVEs in 2023 that are being actively exploited. We had years where that's less true, where people are still kind of using the old stuff. Not a lot of new has been shared publicly, so.
Zach, what do you mean by a high-scoring CVE?
So when you score a CVE out of like 10 or 9 or whatever, the higher the score, that means the higher the combination of ease, availability of public exploit, and impact. So something that's a 9.8, which we had a couple of those in 2023, mean that they're really easy for someone to exploit, 0 authentication required, and you get a shell. Those are the golden tickets. Like you just you worm that stuff.
All right, Dom, question for you. If it's the old song and dance, as Zach says, why is this so hard? Why hasn't everybody done this already?
One thing I think is much more pertinent. We actually have tools, or Microsoft provide tools to do that assessment, to find what's you're vulnerable at. It'll show you. This is not a complicated thing. We actually purvey by being a Defender shop. You can see where your holes are. You can see where the vulnerabilities are, and you can therefore mitigate those. Because everyone says patching, but in truth, when again on the other side of the table here, the problem with CISOs is I've talked to my IT team, and they absolutely say everything is 100% patched. And then you say, and your IT team run all the IT? Well, yeah, they run most of it. How many IP addresses you got? You got 50 servers, okay, but you got 75 IPs allocated. Why is that? they don't have full control over their estates is very, very typical shadow IT and diverse management and responsibilities, accountability, all that kind of crap. It's a hard problem. And this is why people buy vulnerability scanners and that sort of thing, so they can find the things they didn't know they even had that aren't being patched because it's got vulnerabilities. Whenever I run a vulnerability scanner, it just finds the stuff that's not managed, because if it's got anything that's an exploit for is going to be your IT estate should be clean. So generally, or shouldn't, certainly after one pass. So finding the unknowns in your environment is a key thing for a CISO. That's where Defender is great for picking out rogue devices on the network and all that sort of. You can then turn around and go, well, what is that? That's effectively unmanaged and unpatched and the like, and put Defender on there. It's one thing to kind of say patch, but we actually have using Defender effectively as a vulnerability management tool. I've even had cases where people have said 100% patch has been deployed, and I've gone and investigated and found that actually about 3 or 4% of the servers hadn't landed, hadn't worked correctly, either whether they hadn't rebooted or for whatever reason. So deploy patches and then check using the Microsoft tools that they actually have really been applied, and that also that it covers your whole estate.
One of the sort of threads I wanted to get to is, what are the findings that are relevant to somebody specifically on Microsoft tools would want to be aware of? And you just gave us like a perfect one. But what about this lull sites? What are lull sites?
But this is the one that concerns us most at the moment, because this is Microsoft credentials being stolen.
And it's hard to block, right? Like it's hard to block by technical means. So it's more like, how do I train my people? Like it's a totally different approach, because this is a tough one. Like you can't block by cert, you can't, I mean, they're Microsoft sites. And if you're working with one of the many other, folks using Microsoft products and using SharePoint and, using these really good collaboration tools, like what are you supposed to do? Not collaborate? So, I mean, what's left really is like training your users, which is it's easier said than done.
I mean, this is like I would say as revolutionary as phishing was to cybersecurity. I mean, phishing is as old as the hills, but kind of like the more modern, where you get an email that looks very much like what you would expect from your bank saying log in here to re-enable your account, or to approve this or to reject this transaction, something that was genuine. Those kinds of later generations of phishing, and this is that new breed of that.
As it's loading and everything is loading up, it renders nicely, and then my understanding is that it's hot swapped. I'm sure there are multiple ways that this is done too, by the way. Like this is not one way that everyone's doing it for sure. Just like with Evil Engine X, right? Like that wasn't just one way, and people are still using Evil Engine X too. That's they go generate their own certs with Let's Encrypt or whatever.
So it's legit. It's very hard to spot this as a thing, I think, is the nub of this, even as an expert in this field.
Can you walk me through, like, if I were a user who got hacked this way, what would it look like?
So what we were highlighting here was that you get an email, let's say, saying that you have an attachment of some kind. It might even be from someone that you do business with. So you click on the link to go to this SharePoint site or whatever it may be. In this case, I guess a Power Apps domain. You go to this domain. It's like a SharePoint site, and it's a real SharePoint site. It's a valid certificate. It's a real Microsoft site. What that site loads up is, it looks like a Microsoft login, which is not that weird if you're sharing with someone else and you have B2B Direct Connect. You go, like, you are going to authenticate.
It's SharePoint.
So right, exactly. So it loads up using the real Microsoft site, and then it's hot swapped, and that way it still looks like your company logo if you have the branding, and it looks for all intents and purposes like the real deal. But then what you're typing in is your creds, and they kind of forward it through the API to trigger MFA, but they're still capturing it. So at that point, they have your username, they have your password, they forward through the API out to the real Microsoft site to generate a login, but it's from their computer, not yours. And then they, forward on the request. What comes back is MFA, maybe, if you have MFA. Even if you have MFA with numbers, and this is where it gets really interesting because that's the strong MFA. That's what Microsoft calls it, is strong authentication. And so even if they come back with MFA with numbers, they can render that to the end user who's getting phished. They can type in the numbers and authenticate on their phone even and hit yes, that's me, use their fingerprint, face ID, whatever, and then that authentication goes through. And who has the cookie? Not you, actually. The threat actor has that.
How could you possibly train a user? This just seems like I don't know how I would know that I was being hacked.
Like if you're getting something that's linking you through a bunch of steps, I mean, at that first, I know how easy it is to just send someone the current file. Like, why wouldn't you do that? But it just makes, to me, it's so
Yeah.
weird to get a file that says, actually go here instead. I mean, right away, I'm like, wait.
If I was doing this, I'd put a big grey box over the entire spreadsheet so it looked like the data wasn't being rendered or wasn't being updated or something. And you can indeed, using macros and formulas and even have the URLs auto-generated. So the URLs are never in plain text in the document. They're actually, when you open it, then it executes or it formulates them. I think the normal phishing rules apply where, if people are hovering over links, they're trying to do all the things they can to kind of make it a little less obvious. But fundamentally, it's Power Apps, so it's going to, or whatever site it is, and that's fundamentally a Microsoft-owned site, which they may on a daily basis or deal with or not, or even if they Google it, said, is this site trustworthy? Because they've never used it before, it's going to be, yeah, it's fine. You go on a VT, you put Power Apps, yeah, it's fine.
Apart from user training, is there anything that security teams can do to guard against this technique?
One of the things that is doable, you do have the cookie, you do have an authentication key to effectively gain resources, but that key is then subsequently going to be used from various IP addresses all over the world. If you have rules in place and policies in place to restrict access to your resources to particular countries or even particular networks or some such, if none of your people, none of your staff work out of North Korea, then you can put that in place, and that then becomes a real good trigger. So you can say all of our offices are in these places. We don't want to allow people to use these resources from anywhere but these places, and that works really well because fundamentally these attackers are rarely kind of jumping through the hoops as to second guess which country the credential was taken from, which business, what's a legitimate access vector. And that will trigger in the policy as a policy breach, and that will go through us as a SOC and Zach's team, and basically we'll then pick that up and go, wow, somebody's trying to log in from North Korea or from Connecticut. Why would my my team from Iceland be logging in from Connecticut? It's rarely as obvious as North Korea trying to log in. If you see somebody with a with a Chinese username logging in from Iceland, or somebody who's out of the Chinese office logging in from Iceland, or from the Australian office logging in from Bolivia or something. So you can fundamentally, with the policies, put those country restrictions in place, and that's a winner here. You need to understand where your staff are coming in and where they're working from, because in the event of anything going really bad, that's a situation where you want to be able to use those dials to say, okay, no one working from home or no one working from on holiday is going to be permissible because we're in a ransomware situation. But again, it's once the credential's been stolen. Zach's point was about what happens prior to try to stop the credential being stolen, and I think that's a very hard problem at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess the other half is, like you said, making sure you have detections in place for this type of thing after, making sure you have hardened policies to try to prevent in that way. You're not preventing through user education, you're preventing through policy, but and then detection. Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of covered all three parts of this.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today. Dom, Zach, thank you both so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to the Advanced Threat Operations team at Ontinue for putting together this report. We will see you next time. Thanks very much.